Hey folks, Kyle Q again, and I want to continue this video series by talking about two concepts that I talked about in a previous video. The first one is about making training measurable. The second one is about making training sustainable. And again, this is about the subject of programming for powerlifting. And so, making training measurable involves using the variables that you have at your disposal in such a way that you can measure either the increase or the decrease in your performance, and you can relate it to the change of an individual variable. And so when I try to explain this concept to people, I try and liken it to a science experiment, because what we're doing in programming is we are essentially performing a science experiment upon ourselves and upon our bodies, and we're seeing how our maximal strength responds to the manipulation of certain variables. It makes perfect sense if you use an analogy of a science experiment in which you are trying to receive data from manipulating a particular variable and seeing how that situation changes in relation to the manipulation of that one variable. If you manipulate too many variables in any experiment, then the variables themselves and the changes made to those individual variables, those cease to be measurable. And so if you go from something that is on one end of a spectrum and you go to something that is on the opposite end of the spectrum, if you make progress, that's great, you've gotten stronger, but you haven't learned anything beyond the fact that this other thing worked better for you than this thing. You know nothing about what it is exactly about this, about this other thing that works better than this first thing. The only thing you've learned is that this other thing works better. At some point, this other thing isn't going to work better anymore. And when that happens, you don't have any information at your disposal in order to make the correct changes. At that point, you're just lost again, and you're back at step one, where you basically have to choose something entirely new again. And if you do it that way again, you're not going to learn any more information, because all you know is that this one thing, this one training program, worked better or worse than this other training program. The key is to limit the amount of variables that we manipulate at any one point in time. And this is the problem when people use established programs and go from one to another, especially programs that are very different. You don't learn anything about yourself and how you respond to certain training situations. All you learn is that this one method worked better for me than this other method. It doesn't tell you anything about how you respond to volume or frequency or intensity. I mean, it'll give you a little bit of information, but it won't give you the same amount of information as if you make incremental changes and then measure the results. And so we always want to make the training measurable, and the way in which we accomplish that, again, is by limiting the variables. So I'll just give you a scenario. Let's say I've been training very high volume, and I'm going to go from high volume to low volume, but I'm also going to increase my frequency, so I'm going to start training a lot more often, and I'm also going to throw in a bunch of these different exercises. So I'm not going to deadlift anymore. I'm going to deadlift off of high blocks, and then I'm going to deadlift off of deficits, and then I'm going to do deadlifts to my knees, and I'm going to do rack pulls, and I'm going to pull with a lot of chains, and I'm going to do some glute hams, and I'm going to do some hamstring curls, and I'm going to do some thoracic extensions and all these other little exercises. My deadlift gets better. It doesn't get dramatically better, but it gets better. And what does that tell me? Well, that tells me that I've made about a dozen changes to how I was training my deadlift, and any one of those could have had a positive effect. They all could have had a positive effect, or it could have been just one thing that had a positive effect. And maybe the rest of it was detrimental to my training, but there was still a net gain. The only way I end up finding that out is if I start keeping certain things and then eliminating certain things, and rather than go through that process in which I've learned no information, I'm better off changing one thing. And so on my deadlift, maybe the first thing I change is I just decrease the volume because I feel like I'm worn out. Or I decrease the frequency and I start training once every 2 weeks instead of once every week. And I'm either going to go up, I'm going to stay the same, or I'm going to go down, and then I learn in relation to what I was doing before, this thing worked or this thing didn't work. So that's a way in which we make our training measurable. Even if you don't even if you aren't always getting stronger, as long as you're learning more about your training over time, you're making more straight line progress than if you're blindly hopping from one thing to another and never learning about how you respond. If you've been training for a few years, you should probably have a pretty good idea of how you respond to training volume and training intensity. This is stuff where, when I'm programming for people, I feel like we get a pretty good handle on it within the first 6 months to a year. I mean, we learn, okay, this person does better with lower frequency, lower volume training, whereas this person really responds better to block periodization with a long accumulation phase. I mean, that's the stuff that you want to diagnose early on. It's really important. The other thing that I wanted to talk about beyond making training measurable is also making training sustainable. And what I mean by that is allowing yourself, and this goes hand in hand with making training measurable, but it means allowing yourself a prolonged engagement with a particular training stimulus. So we really only want to supply enough of a training stimulus in order to produce a adaptive response and get stronger. Now, we don't want to baby this too much. We don't want to intentionally slow down the amount of progress that we're making, but we want to make incremental steps in maximal strength development. We don't want to necessarily go from being at at like a beginning level to being at like an advanced level in a training cycle. There's one really simple way to produce an adaptation in most everybody that you program for. And to me, I liken it to something like the Atkins diet. I don't know anything about dieting, but to me, it's basically the same thing. With Atkins, if you want to call yourself a dietitian and you want to, it doesn't have to be Atkins. It can be anything that's low to no carb. But you want to, show somebody, hey, my diet system that I have for you works. And let's say you're dealing with somebody that's totally uninitiated and doesn't know anything about dieting. You just drop their carbs down to 0 and you drop their salt down to 0 and you have them drink a gallon of water a day for a couple of weeks. They're going to think you're amazing because, hey, I got to eat all these other calories and protein and fat and I lost 5 pounds. And how did that happen? This guy really knows his stuff. Whereas what you've really done is you just kind of conned the system to, to produce a net loss in terms of the amount of water that person was retaining without really actually, encouraging, the loss of any real body mass. The one simple way to do this in training is just to really increase somebody's training volume. And so if you want to take somebody and double their training volume for a short period of time and you want to make them suffer through some difficult training, it's a pretty foolproof way of producing a short-term adaptive response because most everybody is going to respond to a short-term increase in training volume, but that increase in and of itself is not something that will continue to benefit most everyone. Most everybody will have to cycle away from that amount of training volume and then return to it over time and really train in phases. And so you can do something like that just with dramatically increasing somebody's training volume. You just put them on something like Smolov, and most everybody makes big progress off of that. But the bigger the change, the adjustment in the training, and the more you increase that adjustment, the bigger the short-term return, but the less you actually maintain in the long term, and the less sustainable it is. And the other downfall to it is it's more inherently risky to train that way. And so it's just plain it's a high risk it's a high risk solution to take somebody who's been training a lift once a week and say, hey, for 3 weeks we're going to train this lift 4 times a week, and we're going to do quadruple the volume you were doing before. If they survive it, it's going to work well. They're going to put, if they're a beginner squatter, they're going to put a lot on their squat. They'll probably end up putting at least 10 to 15% on their squat. But that's assuming they survive it. And that's also neglecting to mention the fact that they're probably not going to keep most of what they see in the short term. And so they've been bamboozled into thinking, well, this is the way for me to train. Well, it's not a sustainable training method. So rather than produce that short-term response, there really is no legitimate reason to do that unless you are trying to peak for a competition. Because again, it's not sustainable and it doesn't yield long-term gains. Instead of going from once a week frequency to 4 times a week frequency, go from once a week frequency to twice a week frequency, and over time, as you work through these different phases, increase the frequency over time and really enjoy that training stimulus for as long as you possibly can, because again, this is something that if you milk it over a span of years, you're going to see a much greater increase than if you just try and go from once a week to 4 times a week over a training cycle. It's really about what you can produce for a net gain over time, and if you play that card too soon where you start doing ultra high volume and ultra high frequency training, you're not going to see the same long-term results as somebody that makes those slow sustained changes to their training. Anyway, that's it. I'll have more of these for you soon.